We would like to welcome you to Congressman Hank Johnson's office and the overview of the grants process. Whether you're an individual or organization with little to no experience in federal funding, this video will provide you with essential information on the overall grants process. Let's begin with a brief history on the federal grant policy. In 1977, the Federal Grant and Cooperative Agreement Act was passed to guide federal agencies on how to utilize federal funds, particularly by defining the roles of contracts, cooperative agreements, and grants. To help facilitate the new law, the Office of Management and Budget published guidance that directed agencies to ensure that funds be used specifically for assistance-based projects and programs. Federal grants are embedded in the Constitution and called to promote the general welfare. The Executive Office of the President, of which OMB is part, helps to implement the laws through executive orders and guidance that define administrative rules. Before we delve deeper into grants, let's discuss appropriations. Appropriation is a law of Congress that provides an agency with budget authority. It allows the agency to incur obligations and to make payments from the U.S. Treasury for specified purposes. Appropriations are definite or indefinite. Definite, which means it is a specific sum of money, or indefinite, an amount for such sums as may be necessary. Let's continue our discussions on appropriations. Appropriation bills are to be signed by the President by October 1st, the beginning of the federal fiscal year. The President submits a detailed budget request to Congress around February for the upcoming fiscal year. House and Senate propose budget resolutions, discuss differences, and vote on a final version. The President receives conference reports and signs or vetoes appropriation bills. To break this down further, grant policies are made within 3 stages. In the first stage, the Congress appropriates funds to federal agencies and passes other grant-related legislation. In the second stage, the Executive Office of the President issues guidance for implementing the legislation. In the final stage, grant-making agencies develop administrative policies based on guidance. The life cycle of grant funding has 3 phases: pre-award, award, and post-award. Let's now discuss the pre-award phase. In the early stages of the grants process, the grant-making agency plans and develops a funding program based on its mission, the administration, and congressional initiatives. The grant opportunity is then planned and announced. Once potential applicants have identified an opportunity to apply for, they need to register with grants.gov. Applicants should also check the funding opportunity for additional registration requirements specified by the grant-making agency. When an application has been submitted, the application is retrieved by the grant-making agency and screened for compliance. If it passes initial screening, the application is routed to the appropriate agency program for consideration and review. To recap, the federal budget resolution is approved and the awarding agency assigned. The agency develops a funding program based on the mission of the agency, congressional initiative, and administration. The funding opportunity is then published. Prospective applicants should register via grants.gov. Once the application is completed, the awarding agency will review the application. We will now discuss the most exciting phase for an organization, the award phase. When the review process has been completed, the funding agency notifies the applicants whether or not they have been awarded a grant. The agency also begins working with the award recipient to finalize the legal framework for the funding agreement. Following this, the funds are dispersed. After an applicant receives a notice of award and the funds have been dispersed, they will begin their project. The award recipient is responsible for meeting the administrative, financial, and programmatic reporting requirements of the award. The final phase is the post-award phase. After an award has been dispersed, a grants management officer at the funding agency oversees an awardee's reporting compliance. This process extends across the life of the grant award and involves reviewing reports submitted by the awardees. Representatives from the grantor agency may perform on-site visits with the project director and implementation staff. Oversight may also occur in the form of auditing. To recap, the grant management officer oversees reporting compliance through site visits and audits. Reports are then reviewed to ensure requirements are met. Once completed, the grant cycle ends. We will now discuss eligibility based on organization type. Determining whether you are eligible to apply for and receive a federal grant is very important. If you're not legally eligible for a specific funding opportunity, you would waste a lot of time and money completing the application process when you cannot actually receive the grant. When considering eligibility, the first step is to know what type of organization you represent, or whether you are applying as an individual. Let's review various types of organizations to give you a better understanding. Government organizations. That's any state, county, city, township, special district, and/or Native American tribal government. Education organization. That's an independent school district, public and state-controlled institutions of higher education, and private institutions of higher education. Public housing organization. That's basically public housing authorities. Nonprofit organization. Nonprofits having a 501c3 status with the IRS, other than an institution of higher education, and nonprofits that do not have a 501c3 status with the IRS, other than institutions of higher education. For-profit organizations. That's organizations other than small businesses. Small businesses. Small business grants may be awarded to companies meeting the size standards established by the U.S. Small Business Administration. And finally, individuals. That's people who submit an application for a funding opportunity on their own behalf. Please note that most of the funding opportunities on grants.gov are for organizations, not individuals. Let's now turn our attention to the types of federal grants. The first grant we will discuss are mandatory grants. Mandatory grants are non-competitive, funded by law, and eligible applicants must be awarded. Let's now discuss the two types of mandatory grants. The first type are block grants. Block grants are typically awarded to states and/or local governments. They provide federal assistance for broadly defined purposes such as mental health and homelessness. They are not tied to a legislative formula. The second are formula grants. Formula grants involve the way in which grant funding is allocated to recipients, typically government agencies, and awarded based on statistical criteria. An example of mandatory grant would be Medicaid. We are now going to discuss discretionary grants. They are much different than mandatory grants in the fact that they are competitive awards that allow the federal agency to select the grant recipient. This is based on merit and eligibility. An example of a discretionary grant would be the Violence Against Women or Homeless Assistance Grant. There are several major discretionary grant agencies through the federal government. Please take about 30 seconds to review examples of their focus areas. Here are some helpful tips that may be beneficial as you begin your organization's journey to seeking federal funding. You will want to register with federal grant agencies such as sam.gov and grants.gov. sam.gov is how organizations are awarded money. The U.S. federal government will no longer require organizations to get a DUNS number for registration in SAMS.gov, beginning on April 4, 2022. Look at the awarding agency's website for which you are interested in the grant opportunity. Review their priorities and include their language in your application. Explain how your organization's needs align with theirs. Here are a few more tips as you continue your journey in learning about the grants process. Please keep in mind that federal grant applications can take 100 to 125 hours to complete. This is extremely important when reviewing application deadlines. An organization cannot pay grant writers out of future funds unless specifically mentioned in the grant opportunity. Typically, the organization should be in operation a minimum of 2 years after receiving their 501c3 status. Ideally, they should also have a minimum of 12 months of experience in the project they are seeking federal funding for. When brainstorming the organizational structure of your team, including the following may prove to be helpful. This includes having strategic planning, governance, human resources, fiscal management, partnerships, and program management. Here are some important websites that you may find helpful. Grants.gov is for federal funding opportunities. SAM.gov is to register your business with the U.S. government. USA.gov is for entryway to the U.S. federal government by providing information on federal agencies and programs, as well as facilitating access to the benefits and services for which you may be eligible. FedBidsOps.gov is a government point of entry for federal government contract procurement opportunities over $25,000. Benefits.gov is for personal funding, such as funding for education, disaster relief, or healthcare. GovLoans.gov is for personal or business loans. And last but not least, StudentAid.ed.gov is for education-related funding. Congressman Hayne Johnson's office would love to give a special thank you to the Georgia Center for Nonprofits as well as grants.gov.